Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our last lesson in evolution. It's a really quick one. We're going to talk about what the three patterns of evolution are. All right, so we're going to start with the one that is probably the easiest to describe. It's divergent evolution, otherwise known as adaptive radiation, but the book doesn't say adaptive radiation, so we're going to call it divergent evolution like it does. And it's where related species evolve in different directions, and so they become increasingly different. So again, you can picture you have a common ancestor, and then from that common ancestor, we start branching out like crazy. And so this leads to what we've already talked about before, which are homologous structures. So homologous structures, remember, are the things like different bones. They're things like in plants, we were talking about leaf shapes, right? Where they all have things in common with one another still, but they're very different now, right? A flipper from a whale is very different than the leg of a dog, even though they're made up of the same bones, right? And so a good example of adaptive radiation divergent evolution is that there was some finch that originally landed on the Galapagos Islands and just kind of like diversified. So divergently evolved into all of these different types of finches that eat different things, live in different parts of the tree, and also just kind of like, are generally a lot different now from one another. A good example of that, because we've been using Pokemon throughout this entire unit, is Eevee and all of the evolutions. Like, this is like the perfect example of divergent evolution. You have a common ancestor, and then from that common ancestor, we have all of this diversity where they evolved very differently. Convergent evolution. All right, so we have not talked about convergent evolution really at all. That is where independent evolution happens. In other words, things look similar, but when you look at it, it's just because they grew up in a very similar environment, they might not be directly connected evolutionarily to one another for hundreds of millions of years, right? It's convergent evolution. And so, for example, all of these organisms have wings, but they're not very closely related to one another. Like, these wings for a bat are from an ancestral mammal. These bird wings are from an ancestral bird/dinosaur. And then technically a pterodactyl isn't a dinosaur. Theirs is from an ancestral reptile. So even though they all have wings, they're not very closely related to one another. And so what we call these are analogous structures. So not homologous, but analogous structures. They're organisms that appear, organs that appear in different organisms, but share no common ancestor. Another good example of that, right? If we included now wings of like an insect wing is totally different, right? So this purpley stuff is analogous, but then you see these colored bones. These are homologous structures, like this kind of humerus and ulna and radius. All of these are in common. Like these come from an ancestral organism that had limbs, whereas the wings, not so much. And then coevolution is just when two or more species evolve in response to changes in each other. So you've got this insane-looking plant and this insane-looking moth with a very, very long proboscis. It's like a tongue. And it's basically the only thing that can drink nectar out of this thing because it has this gigantically long tongue. And again, they evolved coevolutionarily, right? Like this thing started to get longer and this thing started to get longer so that they're able to pollinate one another. Same thing, like you can picture it like a hummingbird, right? Like let's say like, there's a particular plant very similar, right? That has nectar that is really, really difficult for a hummingbird to get nectar from. But what if there was a small population or a small series of hummingbirds that had naturally longer, slightly longer beaks? Well, then they would be able to maybe get it. And then as a result of that competition, perhaps maybe like it got even longer. Like, so now the nectar is even deeper in here. And so now that over a million years or so, now we have very, very long beaked hummingbirds as a result. That would be an example of coevolution. Um, Another good one, though, that like I really like as an example, and it's the last bit, is crabs and shelled creatures like clams. So coevolution generally happens in very competitive relationships. So there's normally competition. So a good example of that with crabs and shelled creatures would be like, crabs have to have claws that are able to like break into this particular, let's say, shelled creature. So in response, they get thicker, harder, spikier shells. So as a result of that, maybe the crabs that have like bigger, thicker, stronger pinchers are able to now still get into these ones. So in response, they get even stronger and thicker shells. And so now you get like crabs that are even crazier, right? Like with crazier pinchers as a result. And so they kind of just go back and forth, and it's like a competition that's constantly happening. And that's coevolution. And that is our last lesson. So if you have any questions, please let me know, but make sure you're filling in your notes.